Welcome to Amazing Histories. I'm Gary Au and he's
Lawrence Gray.
Today is our first episode.
And it's going to be about the founding of Singapore.
You mean Raffles?
Well, did he actually found Singapore?
Watch this to find out. Today we're going to tell you all about how Sir Stamford Raffles founded Singapore.
That's me. Hold on, what about this guy?
Actually, I founded Singapore. What the Farquhar? Who's he?
Sir William Farquhar. He founded Singapore.
But I'm sorry, I thought it was Raffles founded it. Singapore has put up these statues. They've even named a hotel after him. And there's not even a Farquhar Street.
Well, actually there was one, but it disappeared in 1994.
That's outrageous.
Farquhar was the first resident of Singapore from 1819 to 1823 and did much to create the success of the fledgling colony. Raffles had to run back to Bencoolen, a town in Sumatra that the British founded in the 17th century and largely forgot about.
But who was he?
Well, he was for a few years considered to be the Rajah of Malacca. He was a Scotsman who worked for the East India Company and was chief engineer in the force that took Malacca from the Dutch in 1795. He rapidly went native, spoke fluent Malay, took to wearing a sarong, married a half-French Malay woman, and became the British resident in 1813.
Not your typical colonial, eh?
Well, yes, actually. The British in the 18th and early 19th century were a very different bunch to the Victorians on their mission to civilise.
Have a look at James Kirkpatrick, British Governor of Hyderabad from 1798 till 1805.
The English still like cross-dressing.
Ah, well, we like to maintain our traditions.
So when did Eddie Izzard found Singapore?
Well, as so often happens in politics, the enemy becomes an ally, and Malacca was returned to the Dutch as part of the settlement of the Napoleonic Wars. Farquhar was looking for another job. He had long been part of discussions about the possibilities of a British naval base to control the Straits of Malaya. The various islands around here were doing a good trade with Vietnam, Cambodia, China, etc., and the Sultan of Johor and his family were earning decent money. The British, though, thought how much more money they could make if they ran the place instead. Farquhar was very familiar with local politics, and when the Sultan died, Farquhar suggested that the British should back the elder brother's claim to the throne, despite the family favouring the younger brother, in return for a small establishment in the southern tip of Malaya.
So where's Raffles in all of this?
Well, Raffles too was looking for a new job, and a little before this he'd managed to wangle a position as governor of Java, but that position was taken away when Java was also returned to the Dutch.
How did he get that job?
Oh, it gets more complicated, doesn't it? Well, essentially Napoleon invaded Holland and kicked out the Prince of Orange, who told all his colonists to surrender to the British despite the French. They weren't particularly keen to do so, though, but the British in the region moved quickly to take them. Raffles at that time was very young, but his older wife, a widow with a large number of connections, eased him into the job. Also, by many accounts, Raffles and his social set were not liked in Penang. For instance, Raffles was not one for dressing up in a sarong and considered it bad form for Europeans to cohabit with locals, which for many a Brit was one of the perks of living in Asia.
So he was a typical snooty British colonist, eh?
Hey, some of his best friends were Malays and he did speak the language. However, he did believe the superiority of British science and culture, which it has to be said was conquering the world at that time. Even so, probably the governor of Penang thought that sending him to the Dutch colony, Batavia, was a good way of getting rid of him.
Get that snotty little Raffles chap out of my sight. Batavia is certainly a place that Europeans need not covet to go to, but if necessity obliges them, they will do well to make their stay as short as possible. Otherwise, they will soon feel the effects of the unwholesome air of Batavia, which I firmly believe is the death of more Europeans than any other place upon the globe of the same extent.
Who said that?
Well, that was Captain Cook. He took his ship around the world without losing crew to sickness, but on stopping in Batavia, 7 of these men died and everyone else fell ill. He considered it a mosquito and filth-infested place.
Just the sort of place to send someone you don't like.
Precisely. And Raffles' first reform was to clean up the morals by banning European ladies from wearing native costume and separating the Europeans from the natives.
Maybe it stopped disease.
Well, hardly. His wife died and many of his friends.
But he reformed and cleaned up the town and...
Well, not quite. His idea of spreading civilization and its values was the looting of Yogyakarta and becoming curiously wealthy as a consequence. He was called back to London to explain how the East India Company was losing money and he was strangely gaining it.
Then they sent him to Singapore?
Well, not quite. After coming to an arrangement, he was sent to become governor of Bencoolen, which he discovered was even worse than Batavia.
So they were still trying to kill him off?
Well, Bencoolen was a 200-year-old British colony in Sumatra that had been destroyed by an earthquake. And on arrival, Raffles became very keen on setting up Singapore.
So then he founded Singapore.
Let's just say that he requested permission to establish a colony and, without awaiting a response from Calcutta, got together with Farquhar and others and set about arranging a sizable annual pension for Hussein Shah, the British-backed Sultan, then brought in the navy and troops and landed in what we know as Singapore.
Then why wasn't he the governor of Singapore?
Well, at that time, the place wasn't much more than a muddy mangrove swamp, so little more attractive than Bencoolen, and besides, there were possibilities of becoming the governor of Padang. So Farquhar was made the first resident of Singapore, and Raffles made himself the agent to the most noble Governor-General with the states of Riau, Lingen and Johor, and I have no idea what that meant, but it probably sounded very grand in Malay. And besides, Raffles was already a governor, thus superior to the mere resident that Farquhar was.
And then Raffles opened up a hotel.
No! A couple of Armenian brothers opened up the Raffles Hotel in 1887. What Raffles did was go back to Bencoolen, where his second wife and children were waiting for him, getting sicker and sicker. Meanwhile, the Dutch were complaining to the UK government about the rightful Sultan of Johor having been usurped, and how dare the British treat their ally in such a deceitful fashion. The British government claims they knew nothing, and that the horrible Raffles had acted alone and overstepped his authority, though they did not tell him to immediately abandon Singapore.
I guess by then it was making them a lot of money.
That's right, Farquhar ditched all the orders that Raffles had given him about how to keep the natives and the Europeans apart, and instead opened up the place for business to anyone who wanted to trade. So trade of all kinds rapidly developed, including opium dealers and Malay slavers and entertainment in the form of prostitution, gambling and cockfighting. It all sprung up within that year, and Singapore was earning more than Batavia.
That must have pleased Raffles.
It incensed him, because back in Bencoolen, 3 of his children died and his second wife fell ill, and his chances of governing Penang were dead. Well, so then he decided to get out of town and head for Singapore, where he sacked Farquhar and took over.
Could he do that?
He was a governor of a British colony, so the local British military had to follow his orders despite preferring Farquhar. The community was up in arms, but Raffles ignored them and banned slavery, outlaws gambling, and orders that morally uplifting pursuits should be encouraged by funding literary and scientific institutions.
That's starting to sound like the Singapore I know.
Well, Farquhar's legacy is still there, though. You've got Geylang and the brothels, and you've got the casino, and multiracial integration. But Raffles is still seen as the architect of modern Singapore.
So the British government started putting up statues to him and telling him what a good job he's doing?
No, he was sacked as well. So Farquhar goes back to the UK to plead his case, and he's very pissed his career is over. It's been destroyed by Raffles, and Raffles accused him of all manner of vices. On the other hand, though, the East India Company is accusing Raffles of using their money and resources for his own personal gain, and they want it back.
But he still succeeded in exonerating himself and living happily ever after?
No, the ship with all his and his wife's goods sinks. The bank he used to handle his finances goes bankrupt, and the courts order him to pay the East India Company £22,000. He does, however, find time to set up the London Zoo. He was nothing if not energetic, but he was a sick man. He faints and falls down the stairs at his home and dies at the age of 45.
What happens to Farquhar?
Farquhar retreats to his estates in Scotland and, still considered a jolly nice chap by his family, he's still embittered by his treatment.
But then they put up the statues.
Well, that's right. Despite all of his associates disliking him, Raffles is backed by newspapers who were egged on by his second wife, who was trying to get out of paying the East India Company the £20,000 that they owed, and suddenly Raffles starts being seen as an enlightened man fighting Oriental despotism, moral degeneracy and slavery, and all the better for sticking it to the money-grubbing, greedy corporate bad boys of the East India Company, who obviously were doing nobody but themselves any favours.
But Raffles still founded Singapore.
Raffles was the governor of Batavia and failed to make that a better place. He was also governor of Bencoolen, which he similarly failed to improve. And the grand schemes for Singapore were impractical and one could say had more than a taint of apartheid about them. Farquhar, on the other hand, was much more of a free spirit. His town might have been a lawless and unsafe place, but it created wealth and opportunity and was brought to its present states more by a long evolutionary process by then the program that Raffles attempted to do.
So there should be a statue up for Farquhar?
I think there should be. In fact, there should be a lot of Farquhars about.
That's right.
An amazing fact. Did you know that William Farquhar's wife was the great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada? That's amazing.